I now call Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank Sue Gray for the diligence and professionalism with which she's carried out her work.
Tonight, Britain stands on the edge of a political earthquake. Keir Starmer's Labour Party, once hailed as the nation's last hope, is collapsing before our very eyes. Not in whispers, not in rumours, but in a thunderclap of resignations, accusations and one staggering betrayal. £22 billion of taxpayer money. Gone. Vanished without a trace. And with it, the trust of millions. What has emerged is not just a scandal. It is an implosion so vast, so poisonous, that it threatens to wipe Labour from the political map altogether. The story begins in chaos. Within hours, the headlines exploded Labour in ruins. Starmer betrayed the nation, £22 billion missing. What followed was not a slow decline, but a rapid implosion, the kind of collapse Britain has never seen before. 43 Labour MPs, senior figures at the heart of Starmer's leadership, walked out in unison. Each resignation letter carried more than frustration. It carried evidence. Documents, emails, financial trails. Proof that public money had been siphoned into the shadows, funnelled into secret firms and empty shell companies tied to Labour's closest circle. The scale was breathtaking. Billions supposedly paid to consultancy firms that produced nothing. Community outreach companies with no records of a single event. Names on contracts that led to deserted office buildings. For years, these secrets were hidden under polished facades, buried in the machinery of politics. But now they were dragged into the light, and with every revelation, Britain's anger boiled hotter. On social media, outrage ignited like wildfire. Hashtags demanding accountability surged to the top of trends. "Where's the £22 billion?" became the rallying cry of a nation betrayed. In city streets, crowds gathered outside Parliament, holding signs that cut through the noise with brutal clarity. Not in our name. What began inside Westminster quickly spread across the country as ordinary people, struggling with rising bills and failing services, dem inside Labour. The rebellion looked less like disorder and more like mutiny. These weren't backbenchers seeking attention. These were Starmer's closest allies, the very people who once defended him in his fiercest battles. Now they declared, in one voice, that his leadership was built on deception. The collapse wasn't political theatre. It was the exposure of a betrayal so vast it shook the foundations of Labour itself. Every minute brought new leaks. Internal memos revealed whistleblowers had been silenced. Investigations were blocked before they could begin. Those who dared to question missing funds were punished, stripped of roles, threatened with deselection. This was not the party of fairness it claimed to be. It was a machine designed to protect itself, crushing dissent, hiding corruption, and feeding billions into shadows. By the end of the day, one phrase echoed across Westminster. From MPs to journalists, from pubs to protests, he's finished. But behind that phrase lurked a darker question, one few dared to say aloud. Was Labour finished too? As the dust from the first wave of resignations settled, the storm only grew darker. What had begun as a political drama now revealed itself as something far more sinister, the disintegration of an entire party. Emergency meetings were called in secret, Labour's leadership huddling behind closed doors in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But instead of unity, those rooms erupted with shouting matches, slammed doors, and threats hurled across the table. MPs who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Starmer now pointed the finger directly at him, accusing him of deception, betrayal, and corruption on a scale Britain had never witnessed. The evidence they carried was damning. Internal memos exposed how concerns about missing funds were deliberately buried. Whistleblowers who tried to raise alarms were sidelined, punished, and silenced. Investigations were not simply ignored, they were blocked at the highest levels. What emerged was a portrait not of incompetence, but of control. A system built to hide the truth, protect those in power, and punish anyone who dared to question it. At the heart of the scandal, one number beat like a drum across Britain. £22 billion. Not a typo. Not an accounting error. Real money, public money, taken from the very people Labour promised to protect. Money that should have built schools, repaired hospitals, funded housing, and eased the suffering of families crushed by rising living costs. Instead, it vanished into shadows. A consultancy firm supposedly paid billions left behind no reports, no strategy, no evidence of work. Another, given over $1 billion for community outreach, produced not a single trace of activity. Every document, every leak, painted the same chilling picture. Taxpayer money drained into the hands of firms tied to Labour's advisors, donors and insiders. The rebellion was no longer confined to Parliament. Constituency branches across the nation, the grassroots backbone of Labour, turned openly hostile. Local leaders who had once spent years campaigning in the rain, knocking on doors, and defending Labour in their communities now declared their loyalty broken beyond repair. Branch after branch released statements online, denouncing Starmer as unfit to lead, demanding his resignation. For them, this wasn't politics, it was betrayal. A betrayal that had shattered trust, not only in the leader, but in the very identity of the party itself. And then came the trade unions. For decades, they were Labour's financial lifeblood, its bedrock of support. Now, one by one, Britain's major unions froze their donations. They issued ultimatums, demanding full independent investigations into the missing billions before another penny would be handed over. Without union funding, without volunteers, without the trust of its base, Labour was hollowing out from within. The collapse was not only political, it was financial, it was moral, and it was existential. Meanwhile, Starmer's inner circle scrambled to contain the inferno. Late-night statements insisted the contracts were legal, the accusations exaggerated, the documents misinterpreted. They called it routine restructuring, nothing more than turbulence inflated by enemies. But no one believed them. For every denial, another resignation landed like a hammer blow. For every excuse, another leak surfaced online, exposing emails, contracts, and financial trails too damning to ignore. Journalists described the crisis as quicksand. The harder Starmer fought, the deeper he sank. Outside Parliament, the fury was reaching a boiling point. Crowds swelled into the tens of thousands, voices chanting in unison, banners slicing through the night with brutal clarity. Where's the 22 billion? Police struggled to control the rising tide of anger as protests spread city by city, from Manchester to Birmingham, Glasgow to Cardiff. What had started as outrage now burned like fury. People no longer saw this as Labour's scandal. They saw it as their betrayal. Pensioners who had trusted Labour for decades spoke of broken faith. Families struggling to pay rent and buy food stared in disbelief, as billions that could have eased their pain were siphoned into shadows. The betrayal was no longer political. It was personal. Inside Westminster, MPs whispered in corridors, torn between loyalty and survival. Staying with Starmer meant political suicide. Leaving meant admitting complicity in corruption. The tension was suffocating. Every conversation ended with the same phrase, whispered over and over like a curse. He's finished. But beneath that phrase, a darker thought was rising, one few dared to voice. If Labour had fallen this far, if its leadership had sunk into schemes this rotten, was it only Starmer who was finished? Or was this the death of Labour itself? By the time the scandal entered its second day, the chaos had grown into something unstoppable. Headlines across every newspaper screamed betrayal, television channels rolled breaking news banners without pause, and radio stations opened their airwaves to a nation boiling with rage. Labour in ruins, £22 billion gone. Starmer betrayed Britain. These weren't just headlines, they were war drums beating across the country, each one hammering the same message. The trust was broken, and it could never be repaired. Westminster had seen scandals before, sleaze, corruption, careless blunders, but nothing on this scale. Nothing so coordinated, nothing so devastating. The shockwaves rattled every corner of the political landscape. Ordinary citizens who had once voted Labour with pride now felt cheated, abandoned, and deceived. Families struggling to pay rent and feed their children stared at the numbers in disbelief. £22 billion could have saved them. £22 billion could have built homes, cut hospital waiting lists, eased the burden of rising costs. Instead, it had vanished into the shadows, siphoned into firms that produced nothing but silence. The fury was not confined to Britain. The world was watching. International media plastered the collapse across their front pages. In Europe, the words Labour implodes spread like wildfire. In America, cable news hosts declared Britain was rotting under corruption. Even rival governments seized on the chaos, using it as evidence that Britain's political system was crumbling. The humiliation was global. What had started as a domestic scandal was now an international spectacle, and Keir Starmer was at the centre of it, drowning in accusations while the world looked on. Inside Labour's shattered core, the rebellion spread like poison. MPs who hadn't resigned yet found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Their loyalty was a noose tightening around their necks. Abandon Starmer, and they risked admitting they had enabled corruption. Stay with him, and they risked going down with a sinking ship. Whispers filled the corridors of Westminster. Lists of names rumoured to be preparing their resignations circulated like a death roll waiting to be unveiled. Panic set in. MPs huddled in corners, whispering frantic calculations of survival, weighing the cost of betrayal against the cost of silence. The atmosphere was suffocating. At every turn, one phrase haunted them: "He's finished." Meanwhile, the opposition circled like vultures. The Conservatives, battered by their own scandals, suddenly had a weapon handed to them on a silver platter. They wasted no time declaring Labour unfit to govern, hammering the betrayal in every press conference, every interview, every speech. Reform UK pounced even harder, framing the collapse as proof that the entire political establishment was rotten to the core. Nigel Farage and Richard Tice thundered across television studios, demanding snap elections, urging the public to tear down the old order. Rival parties smelled blood in the water, and Labour's implosion was the opportunity of a lifetime. And yet, Starmer clung to power. Behind closed doors, he begged MPs to hold the line, pleading for loyalty that no longer existed. Insiders leaked details of frantic phone calls, desperate promises, and offers of favours in exchange for silence. But every word leaked to the press only deepened the perception of weakness. Starmer was no longer seen as a leader. He was seen as a man cornered, desperate, and finished. The harder he fought to hold on, the more he looked like a shadow of the authority he once commanded. The streets outside Parliament told the true story. Tens of thousands poured into London, marching with banners, chanting with fury, demanding answers. Some carried torches. Others pounded drums that echoed across the city like thunder. The chants grew louder with every hour. "Where's the 22 billion? Not in our name." Police struggled to contain the masses as protests spread city to city. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Cardiff, all burned with outrage. This was no longer a protest. It was a movement. A rebellion not just against Labour, but against the betrayal of an entire nation. Inside pubs, buses, workplaces, and schools, the conversation was the same. The betrayal was everywhere. Pensioners who had given their lives to Labour declared they would never vote for the party again. Young activists, once seen as Labour's future, abandoned ship in droves. Families crushed by soaring rents and rising bills felt stabbed in the back by the very party that had sworn to fight for them. The outrage was no longer about Starmer alone. It was about Labour itself. A movement once built on fairness, justice, and hope now stood accused of becoming everything it once promised to destroy. And yet, as Britain burned with anger, Starmer's team continued to insist on denial. They flooded the press with statements, calling the accusations exaggerated, the evidence misunderstood. But for every denial, another leak appeared. For every press release, another MP resigned. Journalists described it as a political inferno. Every attempt to put out the fire only caused it to spread faster. Labour was no longer fighting for control. It was fighting for survival. By nightfall, one question echoed louder than ever, not just in Westminster, but across every corner of Britain. If £22 billion could vanish without a trace, if intimidation could silence whistleblowers, if 43 MPs could walk out in one day, then what else was still hiding in the shadows? What else was buried beneath Labour's promises? And if the rot ran this deep, was the collapse of Starmer only the beginning, or was this the end of Labour itself? Midnight arrived, but the storm did not sleep. Instead, it grew louder, more furious, more dangerous. What began as a Westminster scandal was now a national uprising, a full-blown political meltdown, unlike anything Britain had seen in modern history. The images were impossible to ignore. Tens of thousands of protesters filling the streets of London, their chants shaking the very foundations of Parliament. Torches lit the night, drums pounded like war signals, and banners soared high with the same relentless demand. "Where's the £22 billion? The fury was not just aimed at Keir Starmer, but at the entire idea of a Labour Party that had betrayed the people it was meant to protect. The betrayal was no longer political theatre. It was the collapse of trust, the shattering of faith, and the exposure of a system that millions now believed was rigged against them. Inside Labour's fractured core, panic spread like wildfire. Constituency branches openly condemned Starmer, with some calling for his immediate resignation. Long-standing activists, who had once sacrificed weekends and weathered storms to campaign for Labour, declared their loyalty dead. Trade unions, the financial pillars of the party, froze donations and issued ultimatums. Without their money, without grassroots volunteers, Labour was a hollow shell, crumbling from within. And yet Starmer refused to bow. His team scrambled through the night, drafting statement after statement, insisting the contracts were legal, the accusations misinterpreted, the documents taken out of context. But every denial only deepened the fire. For each excuse, another leak appeared. For each attempt to control the story, another MP stepped forward with evidence that burned through the lies. Journalists described the scene as a political inferno. The harder Labour tried to contain the flames, the more the fire consumed them. Meanwhile, the stories behind the missing billions grew darker and darker. Investigative reporters unearthed ties between the shadowy firms and former insiders, linking them to wealthy donors who had bankrolled Labour campaigns. One company was handed billions for CE strategic advice, but left behind no record of any work. Another, supposedly tasked with community projects, was traced back to a single shell office in London, a fake front for siphoning money. These were not mistakes, these were schemes, deliberate, calculated, orchestrated betrayals of the people. Every new revelation drove the knife deeper. Families already crushed by high rents and soaring costs now felt the sting of insult. The very money that could have saved schools, hospitals and services had instead been drained into shadows, funneled into private pockets. For pensioners, for workers, for families, this was not just betrayal, it was theft. Across Britain, the outrage was unstoppable. Protests spread like wildfire. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Cardiff, all flooded with angry voices demanding answers. Placards painted with fiery slogans towered above the crowds. The chant "Not in our name" echoed across city streets, uniting millions in rage. What once was Labour's greatest strength, its connection to ordinary people, was now its greatest weakness. The people had turned against them. Social media blazed with fury, hashtags rising to the top in minutes, uniting voices across the country and beyond. For many, this was no longer about one leader. It was about the death of a party that had promised change, promised justice, promised fairness, only to betray it all. And still, behind closed doors, Starmer clung desperately to power. Insiders leaked details of frantic late-night phone calls, desperate offers to allies, pleas for loyalty that no longer existed. But with every hour, his grip slipped further. More MPs prepared to resign, their names whispered in corridors like a death list. Every whisper spread like wildfire, feeding the perception that Labour was not just wounded, it was finished. The collapse was not only political, it was moral, it was existential. Labour had built its identity on promises of integrity, fairness and justice. Now it stood, accused of becoming everything it once vowed to destroy. The betrayal cut deeper than policy or politics. It cut into the soul of a nation. Millions who had once placed their trust in Labour now declared they would never vote for the party again. For pensioners, it was a betrayal of decades of loyalty. For young activists, it was the destruction of a future they had believed in. For struggling families, it was proof that the system was rotten to its core. By dawn, the questions echoing across Britain had grown louder, darker, and impossible to ignore. If £22 billion could vanish without trace, what else had been hidden? If whistleblowers could be silenced and MPs intimidated, how deep did the rot go? Was this truly the end of Keir Starmer?